Hey everyone, this is a section from Baruch Knei-Paz's f- uh, The Social and Political Thought of Leon Trotsky. The chapter that I'm reading from is titled The Revolution of Backwardness, the Permanent Revolution. The title of the section that the particular section that I'm reading is, damn it. Where am I? Oh, it's titled The New and Old Model. The new model and the old. And it starts with a footnote. In the presentation and analysis which follow of Trotsky's theory of the permanent revolution, the main sources used are Trotsky's writings during the 1905 to 8 period. It would not be difficult to base oneself on these sources alone, since all the essentials of the theory were formulated during this period. Nevertheless, Trotsky returned to the subject in the 1920s and 1930s in a fairly extensive way. What he then wrote neither altered nor added anything essential to the original formulation of the theory. Nevertheless, Trotsky was then able to make certain refinements and to go into greater detail about the actual, quote, mechanism, as he called it, of the permanent revolution. In order to present the theory as a whole, and in the most coherent way, it therefore seems sensible to ignore the difference in period between his various writings on the permanent revolution and to deal with them as one in theoretical terms. Naturally, the later writings also refer to specific political questions of the post-1917 period. But wherever this is so, it has been excluded from the present purely theoretical discussion, thus avoiding historical confusion, and relegated to the next chapter where questions of the concrete application of the theory are discussed. Of the earlier works, Results and Prospects is the main source for the theory of permanent revolution. Of the later works, the most important is Permanentnaya Revolutia, but various other writings are also referred to, and details of these will be found in the text and notes which follow. End footnote. The administrative, military, and financial power of absolutism, thanks to which it could exist in spite of social development, not only did not exclude, this is a quote, quote, the administrative, military, and financial power of absolutism, thanks to which absolutism could exist in spite of social development, not only did not exclude the possibility of revolution, but, on the contrary, made revolution the only way out. Furthermore, this revolution was guaranteed in advance and on all the more radical character, guaranteed in advance and all the more radical character and proportion as the great might of absolutism dug an abyss between itself and the nation. End quote. Trotsky. Results and Prospects. Having thus argued that revolution in Russia had become inevitable, Trotsky now sought to construct the idea of revolutionary, quote, scenario, which would reflect the peculiarities of Russia's social development and project the necessary political confrontations arising from the peculiarities of Russia's social development. In so doing, Trotsky was, of course, working within a Marxist framework. That is, the scenario would have to incorporate the basic ingredients of the Marxist view of revolution, class struggle, the distribution of economic power, the objective conditions arising from particular productive functions, the strategic importance of a specific social environment, and so on. But this general framework, which Trotsky accepted as the universally valid, quote, method of Marxist social analysis, did not determine the actual content which it encompassed. In his view, a method of social investigation could not provide in advance all the possible particular political forms which social relations may give rise to. Nor did a method of social investigation obligate whoever adopted the method to either postulate in advance or arrive at an inevitable internal structure for this framework. quoting some sentences from Karl Kautsky, in which Karl Kautsky attacked those who used the materialist conception of history, quote, not as a method of investigation, but merely as a ready-made stereotype, end quote. Trotsky noted, quote, we particularly recommend these lines to our Russian Marxists, who replace independent analysis of social relations by deductions from texts, selected to serve every occasion in life, end quote. The, quote, stereotyped form of thinking arose, in Trotsky's view, from a confusion of method with method's results in a particular case, more specifically from a confusion of Marx's method of social analysis with Marx's conclusions about the particular example of Western capitalism. It was this confusion which had led to the assumption that Western capitalism was both a prototype for all societies and the sole precondition for the socialist revolution. In fact, however, for Trotsky, the original Marxist model was valid only in a specific historical and social context. A different context required a different model. Footnote. It can hardly be said that Trotsky's argument convincingly resolves the whole problem of methodology and content in Marxism. The argument is certainly an oversimplification, though Trotsky is not concerned in this particular context with arguing the case of Marxism as an objective science, which is, of course, at the root of the problem. The short answer to the distinction Trotsky makes is that Marxist methodology does influence and even prejudge both content and results. But this is a wider issue than the one Trotsky is dealing with here. Trotsky may be said to be merely pleading for greater sophistication in distinguishing historical developments. See also the subsection, quote, the unique and universal, end quote, in chapter 3 above, and the conclusions to the same chapter. I've recorded that video, and it will be up eventually. I don't know if it might probably be up before this video is. So let me go back. The theory and footnote. The theory of permanent revolution derived from the construction of just such a different model. It may be visualized at first by presenting it in a diagrammatic form in juxtaposition with the generally accepted classical Marxist model, though it must be stressed that the diagrams as such do not appear in Trotsky's writings and are merely a shorthand way of translating and illustrating Trotsky's distinction between the two models. It looks like what's being said here is in the classical Marxist model, there's like the bourgeois state and sandwiched between the bourgeois state and the nobility and the peasantry. The proletariat is in the middle of that. And in Trotsky's scheme, it's the proletariat is sandwiched between a very large peasantry and a smaller state nobility. I'm not really doing a good justice to these diagrams, so I'll read them. Obviously I'm going to read it. These diagrams do not pretend to be complete or exact replicas, but necessarily crude abstractions. Reality is too diverse to be conveniently fitted into straight lines and rectangles, and these diagrams should be seen as an aid to explication, not a substitute for explication. The explication itself will follow. Moreover, in both diagrams, the drawn sizes of the, quote, rectangles should not be taken to represent the actual size or distribution of the different class populations. They are only a rough approximation, nor is there necessarily any relationship in size as between the models. Similarly, the diagrams ignore the subdivisions which can be made within a particular class, e.g. petty bourgeoisie as opposed to capitalist bourgeoisie, industrial as opposed to agricultural proletariat, subdivisions which do not affect the general overall picture which Trotsky's new model seeks to convey. This somewhat schematic and obviously oversimplified presentation of the two models has nevertheless the advantage of making clear both the differences and similarities between the two models. The differences are as follows. Whereas in the Marxist model, it is the bourgeoisie which stands at the top of the, quote, pyramid by virtue of owning or controlling the means of production and exercising domination over political institutions. In Trotsky's model, this position is reserved for the autocracy and to some extent, though in a subservient role, the nobility. In the Marxist model, the nobility, or what remains of the nobility, has no independent economic or political position and is, so to speak, under the tutelage of the bourgeoisie. In Trotsky's model is the condition of the bourgeoisie, or what there is of it, which is one of tutelage. As for the proletariat and the peasantry, their respective positions within the pyramids are the same, but there are obvious variations in size or of population. A much smaller proletarian and a much larger peasant one in Trotsky's model. And, of course, vis-a-vis one another, the size relationship is different from one model to the other. It is the similarities, however, which are crucial to grasping the value of the comparison between the models. There is firstly the overall similarity in the structure of the models, which represents a specifically Marxist way of dividing society, that is, in accordance with the class and economic framework. Secondly, and most importantly, is the similarity of the proletariat's position in relation to the uppermost part of the structure. In both cases, it is identically placed, in the formal sense at least. The positioning is also the same, of course, in the case of the peasantry, but less significant, since in both models there is as if no direct formal contact between it and the, quote, ruling elements. What phenomena can be noticed in these comparisons in accordance with Trotsky's social and political analysis of Russia? There is first of all the phenomenon of a proletariat which is not the product of capitalist development, but of the process of industrialization as such. Moreover, this process does not bring into being bourgeois capitalism, but rather a form of state capitalism. Although Trotsky does not actually use this term state capitalism, Trotsky would discuss it years later in a different though not unrelated context. It is clearly what Trotsky has in mind. Footnote, see chapter 10 below where Trotsky's critique of Stalinism is discussed. That reading is definitely already on the channel as of reading this. End footnote. Not capitalism in the socio-cultural Marxist sense, involving a middle-class, private ownership of means of production, private capital, bourgeois morality, and ideological forms, and so on, has been created in Russia, but industrial production and entrepreneurship under the tutelage of the state. However, as far as the proletariat is concerned, this difference is, in Trotsky's view, purely academic. The worker's economic position, the worker's mode and conditions of labor, the worker's immediate environment, namely the factory and the city, are identical in both kinds of, quote, capitalism, since the constant framework is industry. Identical also are the principles of wage labor and the grossly uneven distribution of property. Since the nature and place of their economic occupation and the influence of their socio-cultural surroundings are the same, their ideological and political inclinations should also be of the same kind. What does differ from one form of capitalism to another is not the nature of the, quote, adversary. In both cases, it is the same fundamental system of economic arrangement, but is actual identity. What does differ from one form of capitalism to another is not the nature of the, quote, adversary. In both cases, it is the fundamental system of economic arrangement, but is actual identity. Whereas in the Marxist model, the proletariat stands in opposition to the bourgeoisie, in Trotsky's model, the proletariat is turned against the autocracy and against the autocracy's, quote, appendage, or instrument, the state, and only incidentally against the bourgeoisie insofar as the bourgeoisie clings to the bourgeoisie's protector. It is in this sense, therefore, that Trotsky believes that insofar as a revolutionary situation and a revolutionary force exist in Russia, they correspond to their counterparts in the advanced Western societies. In both cases, the revolution is of the workers against their, quote, employers, and, as Trotsky will argue, in the name of socialism. But Trotsky's model, as here presented, does not of itself define or describe, neither for that matter does Marx's, either a revolutionary situation or the revolutionary potential of the social forces it encompasses, much less the logic of specifically socialist, much less the logic of a specifically socialist revolution. It does no more than illustrate the main class divisions which exist and the positions of the classes in relation to one another. The revolutionary issues need to be argued by reference to factors that cannot be portrayed in a formal model, by reference, namely, to the social dynamics of the society itself. The answer to the first issue, in what sense is the Russian situation a revolutionary situation, may be said to have been inherent in Trotsky's sociological analysis of Russia's backwardness. It centers on the fundamental disharmonies of Russian society, or to put it in the usual Marxist terminology, on the discrepancy, which Trotsky claims to have now arisen, between the means of production, industrial or becoming so, and the relations of production, still adapted to a semi-feudal environment. Footnote. This follows, of course, Marx's well-known definition of the conditions of revolution in his preface to a contribution to the critique of political economy. End footnote. But a revolutionary situation need not actually lead to revolution. Whether a revolutionary situation does or does not actually lead to revolution will depend on two general and related factors: the capacity of the existing rulers to adapt themselves or respond to social and political demands, or, conversely, the capacity of the ruled to act in a revolutionary way, that is, to grasp power. The first of these factors Trotsky had discounted in its entirety. Trotsky does not believe that the autocracy can adapt the autocracy's self or respond adequately, since adequately here means in effect self-dismemberment or self-liquidation, and no ruling elite can be expected to commit suicide of that ruling elite's own volition. There therefore remains the question of the revolutionary capacity or potential of the ruled. Are they in a position to overthrow the autocracy and establish a new government, and, eventually, a new society? If so, what kind of government must this be, and what kind of society will it aim at? These questions remain unanswered, and to deal with them properly, it is necessary to turn from the schematic presentation to a detailed explication of Trotsky's model of the revolution of backwardness, to the theory itself of the permanent revolution. Okay, so that's the end of this section. Thank you so much for listening. The next section is titled The Proletariat and Revolution. I don't know what it'll be titled as on the YouTube channel.